Autism was first proposed as a diagnostic category in 1943 by child psychiatrist Leo Kanner of Johns Hopkins University, one of the leading figures in psychiatry in the 20th century. As we will see, Kanner's views greatly shaped the perception of autism in that period. Now, while Kanner was first proposing autism as a distinct category, another doctor, Hans Asperger, working with children in Austria, diagnosed what would later become known as Asperger's syndrome, and what we understand today as part of the autism spectrum. In 1938, Asperger gave the first public talk on what we know today as autism. Recall how another Austrian physician, Karl Koenig, had to flee Austria in 1938 because of the Nazi annexation, becoming a refugee in Scotland, where he founded the first Camp Hill community, as we've seen. But here, Asperger remained. Since the Nazi government implemented a eugenics program, viewing people with disabilities as a financial burden, as they called it, empty husks and useless eaters at risk for passing on abnormalities of all kinds, the Nazi government turned disability-serving institutions into places of extermination. Children were fed the special diet, quote unquote, with the idea of ultimately starving them to death. As we've seen, 200,000 people with disabilities were killed by the Nazis, and many more were killed by doctors in such institutions on their own initiative. And Asperger was, at some level, complicit. Now, Asperger had suggested something that would completely elude the medical community until the 21st century, stating, and I quote, "Our therapeutic goal must be to teach the person how to bear their difficulties, not to eliminate them for him, but to train the person to cope with special challenges with special strategies, to make the person aware, not that they are ill, but that they are responsible for their lives." He defended these children, but such defense made no difference under the circumstances. It was not Asperger, but Leo Kanner's voice which dominated, and the psychiatric community puzzled over the cause of autism. Was this biological or environmental and psychological? Leo Kanner suggested that what generated autism was bad parenting. And this shaped much of the thought about autism from the medical community for the rest of the 20th century. He interpreted coldness on the part of autistic children, their apparent inability to connect, actions that appeared rude and wholly unaware of basic social cues, their inability to sit still or play with others. What could bring this on, he wondered. Here began the blame on the so-called toxic parents, and that fell disproportionately onto mothers who were labeled refrigerator mothers, assuming that the children's attachment and social trouble was due to the mother's coldness. And so, a generation of parents experienced tremendous guilt as they were blamed for their children's diagnosis. But what to do with the autistic children? Well, they were to be fixed, restored to so-called normal through psychoanalysis and treatment and medication. And autism became a diagnostic category in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-3, in 1980. And the search for a so-called cure would become an obsession in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, with wide-ranging theories and cure-peddling doctors and other gurus proclaiming the cure in special diets or particular vitamin regimes as the path to restoration. And then the claim emerged that the cause of autism was vaccines. And one of the leading voices doing this was an organization called Defeat Autism Now, founded by clinicians in the 1990s. Now, all of these claims have since been utterly debunked. They are spurious. They are snake oil peddled as science. But even now, these ideas still linger in the popular mind. And all of this shows the extent of the desperation of parents who were seeking to help their children. While the medical and institutional world established these labels and treatment procedures, parents began to organize in a way that was similar to what we've seen in the case of children with developmental disabilities that led to the emergence of the ARC. In 1965, a group of parents with autistic children first gathered together, seeking to find a way to advocate for their children against the medical system that often blamed them, and they were desperate for support and community from one another. And among them was a parent and nurse, Ruth Sullivan. And out of this gathering of parents emerged the National Society for Autistic Children, which is now known as the Autism Society of America. And Ruth Sullivan became its first president. Chapters of the Autism Society spread across the nation, allowing parents a means of becoming activists and seeking to shift control over their children from the so-called experts who diagnosed and dictated and judged back to the families. The Autism Society of America worked to form alliances with other disability organizations, the United Cerebral Palsy Association, the Epilepsy Foundation of America, and of course, the ARC. And they aimed to change the minds of professionals from viewing autism as a form of emotional disturbance to an inborn disability that required care and support. And they condemned the prevailing wisdom that said that institutions were better places for these children than their own homes. In 1969, the first annual Congress of the Autism Society of America in Washington, D.C., Dr. Leo Kanner stated to the gathered parents that autism was innate and not the fault of parents. Something the parents had known for years, but they were now relieved of this guilt by the leading medical voice on this issue. And this absolution was met with cheers and applause. Meanwhile, parents already began to create new educational programs for children with autism, thinking about the entire environment of the educational setting and the needs and the comfort of the children, their sensory experience, the need for experiential learning, and their need for self-care skills. With a concern for the education of autistic children, Ruth Sullivan lobbied Congress and was among the disability rights advocates that helped issue in the Education of All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, which is now known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, which guaranteed a public education for all children in the United States. Before the passage of this law, individual school districts were allowed to reject children that they felt were not worth educating. In 1994, in the DSM-IV, the medical establishment officially recognized that autism was a spectrum, and that the issues that Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger had been studying were in fact the same. And Asperger's syndrome is no longer officially used, though again, this lingers in the public mind. Now, this improved diagnostic awareness also revealed that many children who had previously been diagnosed and labeled with mental retardation had their diagnoses changed to autism. an example of how increased diagnostic precision occurred, and this is something we'll look at in another video. Several developments at the end of the 20th and into the 21st century would transform our understanding of autism. One development was the emergence of new voices serving as autism advocates, all of whom benefited from a generation of parent advocates that had come before them. These were now the autistic adults speaking for themselves. As you'll see in the course, you'll read the revolutionary manifesto of Jim Sinclair in 1993, Don't Mourn for Us, and you'll also encounter the work of Temple Grandin. Another development was continued improvement on understanding the human brain. And related to this was a recognition that there was diversity in the brain's operating systems. And thus emerged a new term in the English lexicon, neurodiversity. For proponents of neurodiversity, autism can be seen as a gift instead of an error of nature. It's not a puzzle to be solved and eliminated, but a potentially valuable part of humanity's genetic legacy. As Hans Asperger had suggested so many decades earlier, our goal should be to help autistic people and their families live happier and healthy and more secure lives, rather than insist on a cure to change who they are. In fact, Temple Grandin warned that efforts to eradicate autism from the gene pool could put humankind's future at risk by purging the same qualities that had advanced culture and science and technological innovation for millennia. The maker of the first stone spear, she observed, could have been a lone autistic at the back of the cave, focusing intently on the subtle differences between various types of rocks, while the others were frolicking away next to the firelight. Dr. Grandin states, and I quote, "If the genes that cause these conditions were eliminated, there might be a terrible price to pay. It is possible that persons with bits of these traits are more creative or possibly even geniuses. If science eliminated these genes, maybe the whole world would be taken over by accountants." The issue is not to cure autism, but ableism.